All right, welcome everybody to Network Plumbing Working Group meeting for Thursday, May 21st, 2020. And first item on the agenda is from Tomo.
Yep. So I'd like to introduce we have some interesting issues in the multi-CNF side. So I'd like to share these stuff, and then also have a little bit discuss about what should be do. So this issue is about some corner case in case actually this is when the HCD is reader is changed. At that time the the Cube API just returned the 503 I think. So the unavailable error messages. At that time um, and then at that time the model CNI does not going to failure. They created the cluster network interface and the sum of the network definition, but the not the everything. I mean that the sum network definition is not created. Then the return the result is the this is the finished. So previously I'm just wondering that the specification that we have the some description not, but to the thank you Dan for mentioning that the section 7.2 in the specification we already have this description, so it should be okay. But on the other side, I'm just wondering that what CNI plugin do for unavailable error. So now I'm just thinking about the models needs to be waiting a little bit. I mean the 1 second or a little bit less, and then they retry several times. It seems to be okay, but also this of course the unavailable does not guarantee that the 5 seconds solving this issue or not. So this is pretty it's pretty corner case, and then the a little bit complicated bug. So I'd like to introduce this stuff, and then if you have some idea or have some comments, I'd like to hear about that.
Hey, Tomo, thanks for bringing this up. I guess I see where it's a possibility that we may do a spec update. Is that something that I guess is a little bit different from what we have in the spec is that I think the spec says something along the lines of, if an attachment fails, the whole thing should fail. And in this case, it's the failure happens before we know there's an attachment or not, right? So it's when we're querying the API. And so anyways, I just wanted to bring that up, and I'll make
It does feel to me like it's really bad if you try and create a pod with multiple networks and it comes up with only one network. That's going to be quite a painful thing to debug. I can see the argument that says, well, in most cases there will only be one network and why stop? But I think I'd rather have it error out if it can't do the whole job it's meant to do properly.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think maybe we should create some kind of guideline that says, you should take n number of tries or attempts or some X amount of time trying to get the annotation before you fail out and just use the default. I guess is maybe, and I guess it could be one of those things where we put it in, it's like we have a section that's like implementation details or something like that. And maybe it's something in there that we just add a note to say, here's a recommendation for like before you know if it has an attachment or not.
Yeah, maybe we could once we test a little bit, and then we could sharing these experiments as the information, the details or some stuff. Yeah, I'm agree on that. So the issue is still in the work in progress, and then if you are interested in, please take a look into it and then watching this stuff, and then if you have some comments on that, please adding your comments in the issue ticket. Thank you.
Thanks, all.
All right. Thanks, Anonymous Tiger, for taking notes. All right, Doug, you're up next with should language.
All right, cool. So I've got the proposal in the state that I believe that it should be in. So basically, all that changes here really is that we say that the status annotation should include the namespace reference, and then we update the examples to just include that, and then I just use namespace A, namespace B as the example names there. So I was wondering if anyone has further input on this. And if you do, that's great. I'm happy to update it. Otherwise, I feel like it's in a state that's ready for a vote.
Yeah, I also agree that it's in a state ready for a vote, and I think that's what we decided last time. So I'm good with that. Has everybody had a chance to review it, or at least a number of people have had a chance to review Doug's proposal? I think it's been on the agenda for a couple of meetings already, so it shouldn't be a surprise. The one thing I did notice, Doug, was that the example below had Mac with InfiniBand addresses in it, which we changed last time.
Oh,
but that's fine. Don't worry about it. The spec hasn't been updated yet for the InfiniBand stuff anyway, so that can just be when we bring the example to the document.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's kind of a merge situation here. Yep. I'll add a comment.
All right, give people one more minute to take a look at it if they haven't already. All right, so the way that we do this is usually a majority of people who show up to the meeting get to vote on it. Please don't pack the meetings. But for something like this, let's just do a normal voice vote. So all in favor of adding Doug's proposal as worded, with the exception of fixing up the InfiniBand keys to be InfiniBand GUID instead of Mac, please say aye.
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 Any opposed or any objections? All right. The language is approved.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate that.
Yep. Thanks, Doug. All right. Next up, we have Adrian with the device ID standardization discussion. Looks like there's been a lot of good discussion on that document. So Adrian, why don't you give an update around the document and some of the changes since last time?
Okay. Well, the document has, I guess, served as a good way of thinking through all the use cases. So I have grouped the use cases in 4 groups. So there is information that has to go from the device plugin to the pod, like how to consume the device. That is currently done using the environment variables that are not standardized. There is also information that has to go to the CNI from the device plugin. I thought of this use case. Maybe someone here can think of other cases that may match this description. I found that in the SRIOV CNI, it has to do different things depending on whether the device is in DPDK mode or not. That information is the CNI has to then re-scan the device and the sysfs in order to find out what driver is currently bound to the device. So there is information there that the device plugin already knows, and already knows how the device is going to be exposed, and yet the CNI is redoing some of that logic. So I thought that it would be useful for the CNI to have a more rich way of getting device information. I don't know about RDMA devices. I don't know about whether other device plugins share this pane or not. I don't know. Also, there is information that goes from the CNI to the pod, like what the original device identification proposal was tried to fix, which an example of this would be the user space CNI, creating vhost sockets. It would be nice to have a similar way to access that socket, that vhost information, regardless of who creates that vhost socket, whether it's the CNI or the device plugin. And then there is maybe a rare use case that I stumbled upon, which is kata containers, in which in the kata containers runtime has to basically runs the containers inside a VM. So the PCI addresses are translated. Basically, there is a completely different PCI hierarchy. The guest PCI address is determined by kata, by the runtime, and the devices are hot plugged, but the pod still sees an environment variable that is pointing to a non-existing PCI address. So kata would also benefit from a standardized way of showing up that information. At least it would be able to do the remapping or a rewriting of that information accordingly. So those are the use cases that I have came up with. Are there any more? Have I missed something?
So the only two things I thought of, and it was more recent, or I would have put them in the document. Yeah. So for the device information from the device plugin to the CNI, I don't know if it's worth adding, but I mean, today with the way SROV works is the device plugin gets the PCI address, but the CNI needs it. And so Multus is kind of intercepting it and passing it down through the CNI arg. So that's already a piece of information. We have a solution for it, but it may be worth documenting that like the PCI address needs to get from the device plugin over to the CNI.
Is that currently done through Multus reading the resource map, or is that some other mechanism?
I had the to-do to go figure out the nitty-gritty details of
Okay.
that, and I haven't done it yet, and I apologize. I can definitely have that done by the next meeting, and I just apologize. I've been doing all the OV and Kubernetes stuff and haven't really mucked with this enough.
I think it is, but I think it's not. So I think the fact that it's a PCI address is, let's say, accidental. Or, I mean, it's not accidental, but there is no semantics that actually expresses that it's a PCI address. I think it's just the device ID, which is what the device plugin returns. So the device plugin will return a list of, well, a list of maps and device specs and environment variables associated with a device ID. That device ID happens to be the PCI address, but I don't think it is something standardized or semantically clear. But yeah, I think we should, double check that just to be absolutely sure.
I just did a quick find in the kubelet client.go from Multis. I threw it in chat what I found, and I will also throw this in the agenda too, if that helps you out, Billy. It may be a hint at least.
Yeah. Yes, I saw that. Thanks. So I guess the point was, though, that is a piece of information that is getting passed one way or another from the device plugin over to the CNI. So, I mean, you don't have to put it, but it's just a thought. And then the other piece of information is from the CNIs to the pod is there is like some config data that's like passed into the CNI that we're trying to get into the container, specifically like DPDK information like server client, other stuff, maybe number of queues on a interface. There's just config data that needs to go, and I think the CNI is the only one that knows that today. So it's more than just the user space CNI creating the vhost sockets. It's also just config data that needs to get, just a config blob that needs to get into the pod from the CNI.
Right. So not only the path, but also more data that would likely depend on the type of device being injected, right?
Yes. And I would put it as a different bullet because it's outside of the user space CNI. Because SROV, when it's in DPDK mode, needs to get the IP address into the container. It's doing it through the network status today, but I would just kind of lump it as, there is config data that the CNI knows that needs to get into the pod, so that that may not be able to pass like through a kernel interface because it's not there in DPDK mode.
Yeah, I think one of the ones in SRID is the VLAN type. More complex stuff.
Killian, if you were talking, that was very muted, or I just heard garble.
Is that an improvement?
Much better, thank you.
Yes, that was my laptop microphone. Yeah, the SRIV, the VLAN tag can become essential when you've got kind of more complicated network topologies and you don't want to create device pools for every single network you've got going. So we've seen use cases where passing in the VLAN tag into the pod using this some sort of methodology like this could become very useful.
Yeah.
So I had asked a question in the document about the Kata containers case, where the information that is on the host and what's inside the VM is quite different. How does that get communicated to the VM then currently about which, so if Maltus, for example, knows what resource and which PCI device should be attached or should be for which network attachment, how does the VM figure that out internally if all of the address information is different?
Well, the relation between a network and a device, Kata wouldn't know it because Kata is a much lower level. So how Kata works, so Kata will receive a OCI definition of a container and it will try to create it. At first, it will create a VM, and then once it tries to create a container into that sandbox, it will hot plug all the devices that it finds in the OCI definition of the container. Where does Kata hot plug the devices? Kata keeps track of all the devices that it has hot plugged, and it determines which bridge or PCIe root port or where exactly it hot plugs each device, because it depends on what machine type you use in the VM and a whole lot of variables. So Kata would know the mapping. So this PCI address maps to in the host maps to this PCI address in the guest. That will probably know, although it only hot plugs VFIO devices for now, but it would be able to determine that mapping.
Okay.
But not the network, the relationship with the network attachment definition, I think.
Right. Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, if Maltus knows that, you know, PCI device A on the host is for this, you know, network attachment definition blue, even if it could pass that information into the VM somehow, that's going to be useless to the VM because, as you point out in the document, the, you know, PCI topology is going to be completely different inside the VM. But Kata knows what the mapping is there. So does this just not work today?
No, this is completely broken today.
Okay.
And we have discussed in several Kata meetings how to deal with this, and all the possible solutions are extremely hacky, and one of the reasons that this is hacky is because these environment variables and this way of passing device information is not standardized. So,
right.
So Kata, for example, Kata would be able to rewrite the environment variable, but it will try to look for every environment variable that has that address as the value and then rewrite it without even knowing what is rewriting, because there's no information there and it's not standardized. And so I guess if there was a standardized way of writing that information for the pod, Kata, knowing what translation it is applying, it would be able to rewrite that information in a good way, in a way that is not terribly error prone.
Okay. Is there an ability with Kata to mount container or mount directories from the host into the container?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it
So that
it
could be
uses
used as-
VirtualOFS.
Right. Okay. So that could be used as a potential communication mechanism.
Yes, everything that is OCI standard, like mounting directories and things like that, works in Kata. So
Is it capable of, or is the system capable of mounting device plugin specified directories into the VM?
yes,
Okay.
the device plugin directories are end up in the OCI description of the container, and
Yep.
therefore, yes, it can add that in the VirtualOFS, and yeah.
Okay.
It also has access to the container annotations and the pod annotations.
Okay. Anybody else have questions on the proposal? Or
So I think
comments on-
that was the use case. I think we should kind of now move down to the
Sure.
proposal part.
Yep.
Unless, I mean, I guess is there more questions on the use case part, I guess?
I mean, I get, from my perspective, it does seem like there's a good opportunity to make a lot of this more consistent. So I think the cases are fairly clear to me, but if anybody has questions, yeah, please ask. All right, I guess move on to the proposal. Billy, you touched it. Do you have any questions?
No, I think we can kind of just talk through it like we did above if Adrian wants to.
Okay. So I just wrote this proposal very. I mean, I have not thought about it like a lot, but I think this is a good way to start. I also noticed that Dan wrote an equivalent proposal on today's agenda. So looking at that, I see that, well, my original thought was we could use the pod annotations in the device plugin. So the device plugin can add extra information in the pod annotations. As long as that information is indexed, or it can be accessed by the device ID that it returns. Given that this device ID is the piece of information that flows around Multus and reaches the CNI, we could make it work. I think Multus could get that device ID, get that information, and somehow give it to the CNI. And afterwards, once the CNIs have run, it could add that blob into the correspondent network status annotation, so that the pod would see one piece, one source of information through its downwards API. So that was my original thought. I think, Dan, you were suggesting using using directories in the host. So yeah, that's another way of approaching it, this problem. So should we discuss it like a high level?
Yeah, I think there's two bits or two parts here. The first is standardizing certain aspects of the device ID and the information that each type of device might need. Like vhost there's a couple of pieces, whereas with PCI, you know, if it's just straight SRIOV, then you only need the address, more or less. So that's one part of it, is figuring out what the actual information is and what format it's in. And then the second part is, how does it actually get down to the container VM or whatever? And those are kind of two distinct conversations, at least in my head.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
we can split it. We can split the what and the how.
Sure.
Right. So let's yeah, can try to split it up, and have separate discussions. Yeah, I agree.
Sure. So when we say indexed by device ID, and when we say device ID, that could be a number of different things, right? Or is that just a single string?
I think, well, I haven't looked into the code in Multus, for example, but in the device plugin, it returns a, let me see. Well, let me double check. I think it's just a string.
Right, and I mean, that string would be kind of arbitrary, right? But it would be expected to be unique for a container and network attachment, essentially, right?
I think it would be, well, from the device perspective, I think it would require to be at least unique for the resource pool, for each resource pool.
Right. I guess what I'm getting at is, like, device ID itself. I don't think we have, you know, I mean, that's kind of the crux of the problem. We don't really have a good definition of exactly what it is. Right now, I mean, we have some environment variable names, and we have, you know, some structured values for what those should contain. But what I'm trying to get at is, it's not clear to me. I think I know what it is, but it's not clear from the document or any of the other discussions we've had exactly what the device ID should contain. And we keep saying, let's use device ID as something, but I don't think we have a good idea of what that is right now.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so would device ID itself be a PCI address? Would it be a path of something? Would it be a combination of resource type, resource name, and something else? What does everybody else think a device ID actually means at this point?
I mean, it can't be always a PCI address.
Right.
That's the right, correct?
I mean, it's going to have to be a couple of things. I'm just
Right.
curious, like, what are all, when we say device ID and we're going to use it as an index, you know, ideally it's not a, you know, 100 character long string. Ideally it's, you know, something that's.
No, I mean, I agree with where you're headed. I think we just need to kind of come up with some parameters on what it is or can be, not leave it open-ended as just any string.
Okay. I think the definition would come from the device plugin API in kubelet, because the allocate request, the payload of that request is a list of device IDs. And for each pod that requests devices, kubelet determines what device it's going to allocate, and it sends a list of those devices to the device plugin. So I think we could start from there as our definition of a device ID.
Well, okay. I mean, either way, it was just kind of a question. I don't want to get too hung up on exactly what it is right now. If there's more stuff we can discuss as well, and we can think about it a little bit more. In the proposal that I did below, I was kind of looking into what the SRIOV device plugin did with some of its things, and I think you have much of the same information up on top as well, Adrian. So there's got to be some common ground there that we can use. And it looks like we basically have the same thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're really similar. I would say between now and the next meeting, and I'm not saying we stop now, but we could take what Dan did and what Adrian did and combine them into one section as far as, you know,
The what?
Yeah, for the what on each one. And even if we have two different ideas where we need to make a decision on, kind of just list both of them together as opposed to Dan's suggestion, Adrian's kind of blend them where possible. So,
yeah, I mean, honestly, I think they're both almost exactly the same. I was just trying to come up with a little bit more specified way of how those environment variables and the resource stuff should look.
no, I agree.
I think Adrian has the same thing. So I didn't have any hard ideas on that.
Yeah, no, I guess I was more just asking for your permission to kind of break up what you had and kind of blend it in so that it's like, no, this is Dan's. No, I kind of just get them together so it's easier for going forward.
Yeah, definitely.
But, okay.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. And
yeah, I think the environment variable name seems pretty straightforward or common. Like, you know, both of us have basically the same format. I copied mine from the SRV device plugin. The values might be a little more interesting though.
yes, so one option I think is to try to convey the maximum amount of information in the value. Try to format it in a way where you can put, for example, in the case of the vhost, you can put the path and the mode and, you know, more information, or have something as the value that you can then use to either query the downwards API or look into a path that you have mounted in the container where you can find more information, or even split. So the fact that we have one environment variable per device is not a limitation in the API. So you can put as many environment variables as you want. So we could even split and have the basic information to keep backwards compatibility, and then have a, say, PCI address underscore resource name extra, pointing to somewhere, or having the extra information there, or whatever.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions, is whether we were going to try to like preserve that existing name, or did we need like for these environmental variables, is it easier to have like a common prefix when you're searching through them to kind of say, okay, here's my subset that we care about. So it's only, or, you know, like a common prefix in front of them, or limit it to 2 or something, so that you're not like having an unlimited supply of these names.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably good to have backwards compatibility. I don't think at this point there's that many different versions. And then have a good, more consistent way of doing it going forward, and then implementations can add both of them.
Right. Right. That's what I was curious about.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, leave the we're not going to undo the existing one, but newer implementations would have to, I guess, do both naming conventions or something like
Right.
that going forward.
Okay, so I mean, it sounds like at least at this point, we should spend some time between now and the next meeting trying to combine proposals for at least the what side of things. I think maybe one difference between my attempt at this and Adrian's was I was trying to encode more information in the value itself because of the different types of things like vhost and VDPA. I don't know if that's a good idea or not. I didn't put any examples down there in my proposal section, but I just added some for what I was proposing there. So any comments on those would be useful. And again, I don't have a ton of experience with vhost or VDPA there. So if those examples are off base or don't convey the information, please comment on that in the doc.
Okay. And one other question is, I'm assuming all these, are we leaning towards like paths, anywhere we say path, we talk about paths on the host, and we're trying to like do more of a fixed location within a container, or are we going to have to try to get that into the container to tell the container where he should look? I mean, I just kind of want to, mine's more of a what's common practice or what's the right way to do it. Is it common to have, variability everywhere, or is it common to say, okay, you should just go look in this fixed directory within the container? It's more best practices.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I thought that it was not going to be possible to do fixed paths or specified paths. And I think that was because you were saying, Billy, that OVS has different paths than some of the other implementations.
Yeah, so at least on the host, I don't
Right.
think you can have fixed paths. And a lot of it has to do with how you install OVS. It's all it has to do around the installation. And part of the installation, you tell it, where some of this stuff goes. But so I think there is some configurability, but it's all at install time of OVS. But I think it's safer to not have fixed on the host, to have a little variability on the host,
Right.
but within the container, what's the best practice there? Is it okay or common practice to hard code, like locations in a container, or is it better to pass in a mapping somewhere through whatever mechanism?
Well, I mean, there are two options for that. I mean, well, you just gave those two options. We could have, for example, a hard-coded path a specified path for all of the network all of the network attachment definitions and associated device ID, environment variables, or whatever else that then could be read. And that's kind of where I was going with mine. The alternative would be in the pod annotations have some of that mapping, either that or a reference to where that would live on the file system. But either way, something has
the latter's
paths.
kind of what I did in the user space CNI that Jan stole from, where I kind of said in the annotations I passed up what the mapping was, just so if for whatever reason you wanted it in a different directory, you could.
Right.
But I did not know what best practices were.
Yeah, I think I'm not really sure, but I guess I don't see a problem with having a hard-coded path. As in, if we decide to specify this, saying information that you need to configure this will live at, var run networks. I mean, that's a bad name, so let's not use it. But
Yep.
var run networks in both the container and any VM. And as long as that's fairly well standardized, and as long as we have good clarity on what those values should contain, I think that would be acceptable. And it just needs one less level of redirect or indirection that things inside the container or VM would need to have to access that information. Because at the end of the day, you need something. Either you're going to have an annotation on the pod or the pod annotations, and you're going to need to know exactly what that annotation is, or it's going to have to be a directory. And either one of those things can be, namespaced. They should be namespaced, or at least we should have the ability to say, okay, in V2 of this API, we're going to use this other directory. That's common practice.
Okay.
But other than that, you still need some key that everything can look for, whether that's a path in the file system or an annotation. So I'm not sure it makes a big difference which one it is.
Is it, I was thinking, is it easier to protect or at least audit who changes what in the annotation option because of the webhooks that you can put and things like that in kubelet, as opposed to if something gets mangled or wrong, or someone tries to write wrong information in a file, would it be easier? I'm just asking an open question.
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends a lot on the cluster and how you've set up the credentials and which kube config gets passed around. So yes, you could certainly use admission controllers to gate that information, to even mutate that information when it gets added to the API. And that would require that each client use a distinct kube security config or distinct credentials, like a different service account or something else like that, that then would have access to those annotations. On the host side, though, I guess I was assuming that if we did directories, that it would be read-only inside the VM or a container. But I don't know how that plays in the Kata case, where maybe Kata would need to munge the information after it figures out what its mappings are from the host PCI device to the VM PCI device. But I assume Kata would have some kind of host file system access and be able to update that information. But I was assuming that nothing inside the container or VMs would be able to write to it.
Okay.
So another question here. The host path that's named there has the container ID or pod namespace and name, right?
Which section are you looking at? Were you
Sorry,
looking at
down at the very bottom, nearly the second last bullet point.
Yep.
So
yeah,
I don't think the device plugin has that information. If it was to be mounted by the device plugin.
You're right. You're probably right.
I think the device plugin just gets an allocate request of type of device, basically.
I don't think that, well, for the CNI itself, I don't know if he knows it either. He knows the pause container ID.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why I was thinking like pod, maybe.
Yeah.
Or pod namespace plus name, because at least those things are going to be unique on that node. And we could also use pod UID. Because that will actually be unique across the cluster. And I mean, that is actually a very good point. Pod UID should be what we use there if we don't have container ID, because when a pod gets restarted, so for example, there are cases in the Kube API where if you delete a pod very quickly and then restart and then create that same pod, it will have a different UID, but maybe components on the node won't be paying attention to the UID change. And so they'll think that this is actually exactly the same pod as it used to be.
So
if they're coded correctly, then they don't have that problem, but that's not always the case. So indexing on UID for pods is a good thing.
So just from the device plugin point of view, I don't think the device plugin knows anything about pods either when an allocate is called, which is when I think it can mount directories.
All right. So, okay, that's I'll go look at that and see if I can modify the proposal.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Yes,
No
'cause we-
pod information.
Yeah, but we definitely need some uniqueness so that one pod can't see another pod's like socket files or data. So
Yeah.
I've always been struggling with that on like where to stuff this stuff.
And maybe that's the gap in my understanding here between a directory-based approach and a pod annotation-based approach.
Could it just be passed as an environmental variable? Is there something?
No, the problem is with the mount point. So in the mount, when the device plugin specifies a mount, it specifies both host and container path. So if the device plugin does not know about container IDs, then it can only, those paths in the host can only be unique per device or per resource pool / device. And therefore, I don't know, can Multus modify that mount on the fly?
I mean, I think it's a good point, though, that the device plugin could pass back the environment variable that says where that stuff is supposed to be on the host file system, and then Multus or anything else could look at that and find out. And the device plugin would just create a unique ID that had nothing to do with the container or the pod.
That's funny. That's kind of where I ended up on some of the user space because I could never.
Okay.
It was kind of chicken and egg. I could, I was more on the CNI side, but I could never figure out who knew what, where, and make it all work. So I ended up having to do just like I wanted to do something that was that made had a context like a container ID or something, but I ended up doing random, numbered or my own random UUID so that I could make it unique and just had to pass that around.
Okay. All right. I'll take that into account and see if I can update my strawman proposal here for the next time. Thanks. Good points. And that's what we're here for. Poke holes and everything.
Yeah.
All right. So we have about 2 minutes left. I think it's good discussion so far. And we've got some things to do coming out of it to consolidate at the very least the what information around how environment variables should look, and then continue iterating on the proposal here. So in the last minute, are there any other comments or a quick discussion? All right, and we can also continue discussion on the plumbing Google group / mailing list, just so that everybody knows. If you're not on that list or you're not subscribed to that Google group, we have a link at the top of the plumbing working group agenda. So you can just go request subscription and you will get approved.
Yeah, so I had two things. One, thanks for spending the time in the network plumbing to talk about this stuff. I'm fine keeping this stuff at the end of the agenda so that we can cover all other business because we tend to eat up the rest of the time. So I think it's good practice to keep this at the end so we can just let it go unless someone has something urgent they need to bring up. Second, quick question. Purely just random with these Google Docs like this, is there a way, how do you, like Dan, I see you as your name, but I see, like you said, like anonymous turtle, and I don't know what I show up as. How do you control whether you show up as a blobfish or your name?
Yeah, so if you're logged in to Google Docs when you're editing, I believe this doc is open for everybody, so that allows anonymous editing as well. But if you're logged into your Google account in the top right-hand side
Okay.
of the doc, then you should show up as yourself.
So I'm
Yeah,
showing
and-
up as Billy right now. I'm not
Yep.
showing up as a random.
Yeah, then you're good.
Yeah.
And I think that's best practice, at least if you're going to be commenting or editing. Just make sure that you're logged in. At least for like the plumbing working group CRD stuff, that requires a login to comment or suggest, just so that we can keep track of who's changing what and have some kind of attribution trail.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you're going to leave comments or you're going to leave suggestions or edits, please make sure you're logged into a Google account. So good points, Billy.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
And with that, we're out of time. So see everybody in 2 weeks. Thanks again.
All right, catch
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Bye.
Good discussion.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day, guys.